All right, let me make that a little smaller. Let me see. Okay. Hey, welcome back to Behaviorism and Meaning. Today we're talking about George Herbert Mead, George H. Mead there, but his name's very long, so I did it with an H. But usually people spell out George Herbert Mead, and he is one of the last, or well, the last of the early or classic pragmatists that we're going to talk about. So we talked about Peirce, we talked about James, we talked about Dewey, we talked about Royce, and Mead is basically the last of that group. Yeah, so after this, we'll move into somewhat more modern figures, or figures who were more inspired by these people, students of these people. Mead was basically a contemporary of Dewey. He was actually a student of Royce. So, yeah, Peirce and James and Royce were kind of the older original pragmatists, especially Peirce and James. Then came along Dewey and Mead, and then, yeah, James dies in 1910 or something. Peirce dies several years later, and Dewey lives for a long time after that. But then you get kind of these new people that were students of Royce or James or Dewey or Mead and so on. So anyway, the last of the early pragmatists. As I mentioned, he was a student of Royce, who I talked about in another video, also a colleague of Dewey, who I talked about in another video. They worked together at the University of Chicago for a fairly long time, a few decades, if I remember the dates correctly. Trying to remember exactly when Dewey went to the University of Chicago, but anyway. It's not always easy to distinguish Mead and Dewey, since they knew each other well, they knew each other's work well, they influenced each other a lot, so it's hard to say, sometimes it's difficult to differentiate Mead and Dewey, but there are very distinct aspects of them, and we'll see some of those today. And there's different emphases, maybe, is a good way to think about it. They emphasize somewhat different things, but there's a lot of compatibility among their theories. Dewey tends to overshadow Mead, I think partly because he lived a lot longer. Dewey lived to be 90-something, 93 maybe. So he outlived Mead by 20 years or so. And he published a lot more. Dewey published a lot more than Mead. Mead published several, well, more than several, published many articles when he was alive. Not really any books. Yeah, I don't believe Mead published any books while he was alive. There are 4 or so, depending on what you want to include, 4 or so books published under Mead's name, which were put together after he died by his students. But so anyway, there's various reasons why Dewey is fairly more well known. But Mead is worth learning about in his own right. He gives some different perspectives on things than Dewey. Like Dewey, Mead could pretty much be described as a behaviorist, and was probably more direct about that than Dewey. He wrote a lot. He commented quite a bit on Watson's work, fairly critically, and Mead called his own theory, or at least part of his theory, as social behaviorism. Was often calling what he did behavioristic, but not exactly in the Watsonian way. I should give you a sense of the dates again. So yeah, Mead a little slightly younger than Dewey. So Mead, just a note, after this we'll be talking about Charles Morris, and the next video I have planned will be about Charles Morris, who was a student of Mead. Anyway, I'll say more about that later or next time. I was planning to talk about Titchener. I originally had Edward Titchener's name on there, but after reviewing his work, I decided it didn't really fit that well into what I'm doing here. So it's interesting to learn about, but it kind of touches on a behavioristic viewpoint, but it's, yeah, I think it's kind of its own thing. It's not really part of this tradition very much. Boring, the psychologist Boring, viewed Titchener as tending towards behaviorism in his later work, but it's really kind of subtle and not, yeah, not quite in the same tradition or the same category as what we're talking about here. So I decided to take that out, and we'll go right into Morris after this. And then we got a few more major people to talk about: Skinner, Peckham, Osgood, probably Osgood's difficult, and Peterson. So anyway, Mead does write a lot about writing. So important. I should have displayed this earlier. But yeah, as you see at the bottom there, meaning is an important focus in his work. It's an important word. He doesn't always use the word meaning. He might use signification or things like that. But it's an important topic in many of his publications, in his writings. And yeah, so you could choose a lot of different things to read if you're interested in the topic of meaning. It's addressed in many things that he wrote, so it's kind of hard to know where to begin, but I am going to focus mainly on his famous Mind, Self, and Society, one of those books published after he died by his students, I believe, maybe colleagues. Morris, I believe Charles Morris put this one together, but I think he had help from other people. Anyway, the part 2 of that book, especially, I mean, you find meaning discussed throughout, but part 2 is especially to the point. So that's what I would recommend if you want to get a more succinct view of Mead's theory of meaning without reading through all his writings. And there's actually quite a lot of material to go through, even though he didn't publish everything. A lot came out after he died. And there's also a fair amount from before he died. But anyway, today, this is similar to, again, as always, to what I've done before in these meaning videos, with a slight twist. So we'll talk about meaning of objects. We'll begin with the meaning of objects. Then we'll move into, so gestures. Gesture is important for Mead. The meaning of gestures. Mead was did he study with Wundt? I don't remember. But in any case, he was influenced a lot by Wilhelm Wundt, as was Dewey. But gesture was an important category, an important topic in Wundt and Mead takes that up, especially with some changes. And he also talks about the relationship between gesture and significant gestures, which is a little different. It can be a slightly confusing distinction, or maybe a subtle distinction, but an important distinction. And so we're not, and that's where you get like ideas, what we've called with other philosophers, concepts or ideas. They would talk, that would be significant gesture or significant symbol for Mead, but he also has this other category of gestures which are not significant in the same way, which are maybe more like objects in a certain way, but they're, of course, a bodily movement, bodily production of an organism. All right, so let's dive into that. Make sure, okay. Yes, let's dive into that. So Mead on the meaning of objects. All right, so as with other pragmatists, for Mead, the object has meaning in terms of its content and function, and this is basically understood perceptually and behaviorally. So the content is like what we perceive, what comes into our senses, its sensory qualities, and then the function is what we can do with an object. So what do we do with it? How do we act toward it? How do we respond to it? Those kinds of things. We've talked a lot about the meaning of objects before, but among pragmatists and behaviorists that we're talking about, Mead probably spends the most time trying to figure out how something actually becomes an object. We haven't talked about that too much before. So how does something become an object? How is it objectified? How does it come to have this content, this perceptual content that we say objects have? So James mentioned that a little bit. James mentions this a little bit, that attention carves out objects from what he called the perceptual flux. So William James talks a lot about the perceptual flux, and then our attention carves out particular objects. Mead is gonna, that's still kind of vague. Mead is going to be a little more specific about that. So how do we objectify the world? How do objects come into existence as objects for us, as something with, might say, thingness or thinghood, right? How do they come to have the particular perceptual content that they have for us? Or in other words, how do they become meaningful in that sense? Meaningful in the sense of having a content as having a perceptual existence. So for Mead, we objectify the world. We turn the world into objects through a combination of contact perception and distance perception. This is a very important distinction in Mead's work that goes throughout a lot of his writings on perception and action, the distinction between concept perception and distance perception and their interrelation in actual perception, actual acts of perception. So to explain this a little bit, contact perception is primarily touching. So actually contacting something, touching it. Distance perception is more seeing and hearing. And then I don't know if he is super clear about this, but I would maybe say smell and taste are somewhat in between. I think Grace de Laguna is a little more precise about some of this distinction, but I don't, again, there's a lot of writing to go through. But again, this is also a distinction that's really important in the work of Grace de Laguna. And I'm curious where it comes from. You do see references to it in the early 20th century. I think especially in evolutionary centered work or evolutionary, Darwinian evolutionary inspired work, you get this distinction between contact and distance perception. You might sometimes find different terminology. And yeah, I'm not sure how, at least from my readings from more recent readings of more recent writings on these topics, this distinction is not made as much of now, but I think it is a very important distinction to keep in mind: contact and perception and distance perception and their interrelationship, so how they get combined. So we first learn to distinguish objects by touching them, Mead argues. I mean, this seems pretty obvious if you look at babies, for example, infants, how they learn about the world. They learn a lot at the beginning just by grabbing stuff, touching stuff, moving their hands over stuff, playing around with stuff with their hands and their bodies. So we first learn to distinguish objects by touching them, by feeling their contours, the resistances they have to our bodies, and especially our hands. The hand is very important for Mead. And there's some interesting later writings about hand by other people. So this idea did get taken up in, or has been taken up in subsequent philosophy, but maybe not as much as you might expect. I mean, the hand is incredibly important, I think, for people. So we learn about the relationship between grasping efforts and our pushing efforts and objects' resistances. We learn about the relationship between our hands movements and the object's shapes. So even before we really see that objects have different shapes, I think we feel that objects have different shapes. But of course, as we're feeling stuff, we're also looking at it. Of course, I'm assuming kind of the average child here. People are born with different capacities, and sometimes people are born with different eyesight, or people have been born without arms and stuff. So something similar goes on in in blind children or children without hands, but they might use different parts of their body, different senses. But something similar happens. I'm just gonna To make things simple, I'm going to talk about kind of the average person. So we see what we're doing also as we're feeling, as we're understanding the world through our hands, through contact perception. And this is all occurring in what Mead calls the manipulatory area. So the manipulatory area is another important concept for Mead. It's the area that we can actually handle, that we can get our hands on at any particular time, the manipulatory area. So the standard object, so to speak, is the one that's within our reach. The standard object, standard size, and so on, that's the objects in our manipulatory area, and then other things are judged as compared to that, because that's what we first have experience of. We don't really see that much in the distance. At least as infants, you see things that come close to you within your sort of manipulatory area, things that you can put your hands on. And eventually later we learn to kind of distinguish a more distant world. We transfer, I think Mead will say, we transfer our experience of the manipulatory area to the broader, more distant world, which is mediated by our distance receptors rather than contact receptors. So when we see an object at a distance, we have an incipient response, or we tend to respond to it as if it were in our body's manipulatory area. So it calls out the effort, or the beginnings of our effort of reacting to its resistance. So to see something in the distance is to begin to perceive it as if it's in your manipulatory area. So, or you begin to react or respond to it as if it's something that you can touch. You judge it according to your past experiences of handling similar kinds of objects. And I think I have a slide. Yeah, so Mead is pretty good about tying his ideas into more traditional philosophical ideas. He had a rich understanding of the philosophical tradition. And this contact versus distance distinction can give you an interesting or a new way of understanding the traditional difference between primary qualities and secondary qualities. At least in English, this comes to us from the 18th century, especially. So traditionally, primary qualities were things like solidity, extension, motion, quantity, and shape, which were supposed to be objective. But really, Mead wants to say these are related to our first experiences. So they're primary in that sense. They're related to our earliest experiences, our primitive or primary experiences of manipulating the world with our bodies. So in that sense, these things like solidity and shape are primary qualities. So we try to grasp whatever we can, and we feel its shape and weight and contours and its motion. Is it moving? How does its weight change as we hold it in different positions? Does it try to get away from us? Does it stay in our hand? Things like that. Yeah, and then this ties in with Dewey's work as well, as Dewey has shown and argued that the secondary qualities like color and taste and smell come later. So things like color come later when we begin to need to distinguish one manipulable object from another. So early, we don't need to distinguish colors as much, for example, or tastes. We don't have as refined of a sense of taste or smell or color as newborns, for example, that we have later on. And that comes from needing to distinguish more finely different objects that it might be similar in certain ways. Yeah, so it's only after we've perceived the so use, I want to mention use of an object might also be considered a secondary quality, right? So infants don't know right away how to use an object. Some objects they do, like a bottle, they might have a more intuitive sense of what to do with it. Right? They're always putting stuff in their mouth to see, but not every object is used by putting it in your mouth. So in some sense, maybe the use of an object is a secondary quality to it. But it's only after we've learned to perceive the world as a set of manipulable objects that we really learn what to do with most of them. The infant grasps with its hands and other appendages far more things than it actually knows how to use. So children are always grabbing stuff, even if they don't know what it's for, what to do with it. So yeah, a few quotes here, a couple of quotes. Actually, just one quote at the moment. So Mead says, our perception of physical objects always refers color, sound, odor to a possibly handled substrate. So a possibly handled thing, right? Some kind of material thing. A fact which was, of course, long ago recognized in the distinction between the so-called primary and secondary senses. And I think this can also be a way for understanding the sublime. I don't think Mead gets into this topic, really. He does write a little bit about aesthetics, but I don't know. I haven't come across him discussing the sublime. But I thought maybe this is an interesting way to think about his theory. The sublime is an important topic in different fields. So the grounding of objecthood in manipulatory experience, right? So an objecthood is an object is that which we can manipulate, at least in our early experience. So the grounding of an object in this kind of experience of manipulation may also provide an explanation for the sublime, something that totally exceeds our organism's attempt to respond to it as manipulable. So we tend to respond to distant objects as manipulable based in our experience of objects in our manipulatory area. But the sublime, I think, is that which exceeds that. Or at least that's one way to think about it. So I think in the painting here, these are examples of artists trying to portray the sublime. So an avalanche, for example, something that we don't really have a manipulatory experience with, that kind of exceeds our expectations, our ability to respond. Or a volcano, right? Could be another example of something that's sublime in that sense. Because I'm talking more in like the 18th, 19th century sense of sublime, not as, there's some different definitions of sublime. Okay, so that's what I want. Yeah, I guess I was going to talk about say more about the object in the distance. The object at a distance is defined by our anticipation of the resistances it offers to our reactions upon it. The other factor is the uses to which the object could be put. So use or function, so again, meaning in terms of function. We talked about content a little bit, and the content comes from our manipulatory experiences and contact perception and distance perception, both, but it begins with our manipulatory experiences. And that's an important part of the content of the object is the resistance that it offers to our manipulation, our attempts to manipulate it. As well as later on our other distant senses, the sounds it makes, the way it impacts our sight. So yeah, the distance object thus comes to be what we can do with it, or what we can do to it, or with it, or by way of it, or what it can do to us. So this gets more at the function side of meaning, as we've seen for the various pragmatists so far. Is usually a content side and a function side. Here, Mead is addressing the function. So what we can do to something, or with it, or by way of it, or what it can do to us. He also says, oh, that's what I wanted to mention. Okay. So in this, so meaning, to say more about this, is for us, it's the meaning for us of an object is our readiness to do a whole series of things with reference to it. Is another way he puts it. It's our readiness to do a whole series of things with reference to it. He also says that the meaning of an object is an organization of attitudes. So readiness to do something, or your attitude towards something. This organization of attitudes, he says, can be found in the nervous system. So the readiness to act is there in the nervous system. So it's not a kind of ethereal thing. These attitudes constitute the idea or the concept of an object. We've heard that a lot. So he's bringing a concept more into the function side rather than the content side. Mead gives, so one example, Mead gives the example of a horse. We saw that with Royce. Royce talked about horses, and so does Mead. Of course, Mead was Royce's student. For someone who knows horses, a horse has a fairly rich meaning, depending on how well they know horses. But the horse is the focus of many different kinds of acts. It's something to be ridden, something to be fed, something to be washed, something to be bought or sold, something to be aesthetically admired, maybe, and so on. Right? When such a person who typically engages in these different behaviors towards a horse approaches a horse, Mead suggests that all these acts are initiated. So there's a like a tendency to engage in all these acts, but at a particular at a particular moment, depending on the context, one is going to be dominant. So if you know it's time to feed your horse, that act is going to dominate, although you might have tendencies towards all these other things, like thinking about how much you could sell the horse for, thinking about what it feels like to ride the horse, admiring the beauty of the horse, things like that. So you might have tendencies to do these other things, but generally one act is dominant. All right, so let me read a somewhat longish quote. There's a few kind of long quotes I want to go through. So this is one of them. So this implies a definition of meaning. What I mentioned before implies a definition of meaning, that it is an indicated reaction which the object may call out. So an indicated reaction, a behavior that the object may call out. When we find that we have adjusted ourselves, to a comprehensive set of reactions toward an object, we feel that the meaning of the object is ours. So when you have a comprehensive set of reactions toward an object, you know the meaning of the object. But that the meaning may be ours, it is necessary that we should be able to regard ourselves as taking this attitude of adjustment to response. So it's kind of a self-consciousness thing that he's bringing in here about knowing the meaning. We must indicate to ourselves not only the object, but also the readiness to respond in certain ways to the object. And this indication must be made in the attitude or role of the other individual to whom it is pointed out, or to whom it may be pointed out. So he's bringing in the social and conscious aspects of meaning, of knowing that you know the meaning of the object. and being able to know that the other person knows the object. All right, so I'm not going to get too much into the social stuff and the consciousness stuff, which is an important part of Mead's writing, but that we'll talk about that in another kind of lecture, another kind of video. So another kind of long quote, but it's worth going through some of these important passages in Mead's writing about meaning. This is more about the social aspect, which again I want to touch on, give you some sense of it. That's an important part of his work. The social process, as involving communication, is in a sense responsible for the appearance of new objects in the field of experience of the individual organisms implicated in that process. So talking about how objects come into existence again, and that's also a social process. Organic processes or responses, in a sense, constitute the objects to which they are responses. That is to say, any given biological organism is, in a way, responsible for the existence, in the sense of the meanings they have for it, of the objects to which it physiologically and chemically responds. So organisms create objects, in a sense at least. In the sense of the meaning of the object for the organism, that's a product of the organism. There would, for example, be no food, no edible objects, if there were no organisms which could digest it. And similarly, right, so you can't have food if there's nothing there to eat it. It might be something, some kind of physical substance, but it's not food unless there's actual organisms that use it as food. And similarly, the social process, in a sense, constitutes the objects to which it responds, or to which it is an adjustment. That is to say, objects are constituted in terms of meanings within the social process of experience and behavior through the mutual adjustment to one another of the responses or actions of the various individual organisms involved in that process. An adjustment made possible by means of a communication which takes the form of a conversation of gestures in the earlier evolutionary stages of that process, and of language in its later stages. All right, so that's a complicated thing. I'm going to try to break it down, I think. Yeah, I've got a kind of summary of that, or attempt to break it down in a different way. So our attitudes create the meaning of the environment. We talked about attitudes, or the tendency to respond in a certain way, tendency to act. So our attitudes create the meaning of our environment. Our ongoing activities pick out the appropriate environment. This is something he says in a different place, but it's related to what he's talking about here. So we create a certain environment by what activities we are engaged in at a particular time. When we're hungry, we pick out environments that have food in them, or are likely to have food in them. So we also move towards environments based on our organic conditions at a particular time. So there might be food around you, but it's not important to you. It's not really part of your environment until you're hungry. If there's no food around you, you'll seek out an environment that has food in it. So we see the world in that case in terms of our hunger. The meaning of certain objects becomes, are they edible or not? Hunger brings new objects into existence, food. So there would be no food if there was no hunger, right? The thing may exist regardless, and Mead he emphasizes in various places, he does believe the external world is really there. There's really stuff out there, outside of our bodies, or outside of our minds. I don't know whatever, however you philosophically want to put that. But Mead does believe there's real physical stuff out there, but it takes on the meaning that it has only in relation to a particular organism. So food takes on meaning as food only when an organism responds to it as food, as a tool of organismic satiation, right, of filling itself up, getting energy, and so on. Mead sometimes calls this parallelism, which might be slightly confusing because parallelism is used in philosophy and other fields in different ways. But Mead sometimes calls this parallelism, meaning there's a parallel between the attitude or the set of the organism and the objects answering to it. So the attitude or set of the organism on one side, on one hand, and the object or objects answering to it on the other. So you have these parallel parts. I'm trying to show as like two sides of a parallel there. It's maybe not super clear. But yeah, organized attitude is one side of the parallel, and then object answering to it is the other side. So the meaning of the world comes into existence through our attitude of response. The situation, of course, this is meant to be fairly broad, covering many different types of organisms. The situation gets more complicated with humans, as everything tends to with humans, because one of our attitudes of response is to label things with words. So even if we are not hungry or are in the presence of something we would never eat, right? There's certain kinds of things that other people eat. You see it and you're not going to eat it. You never plan to eat it. It doesn't look appealing to you, but you recognize what it is and that people eat it. So you might be in the presence of something that you don't plan to eat, or you're not hungry, or something you're never going to eat, but you might still call it food. You might recognize it as food. You would expect that things are different in non-language using animals. It's hard to know for sure. Do they recognize something as food when they're not hungry? Humans, at least, can recognize something as food even if we're never going to eat it, because we have this symbolic language that we can apply to it, and that helps it maintain a certain character that it might not if we did not have language. But does food exist for a non-human animal that is not hungry? Is a fly still food for a frog that has already eaten too many flies? Here I'm interpreting Mead's ideas here. These are not quotes from Mead. So something to think about. I don't know if there's any definite answer to that question from animal sciences or anywhere else, but something to think about. As I mentioned, Mead ties in his work to various traditional philosophical topics. I want to mention a few of these before we go on to gestures. So one of these is substance versus attributes. The attributes are also sometimes called qualities or properties. And he sees this as related to invariant as compared to variable response. So I have a question mark there. Is this a suitable translation? We'll see. So philosophers sometimes talk about substances and their attributes or properties or qualities. Traditionally, substances are something like the fundamental entities of reality. Whereas entity is kind of the same, translating substance, but it's the kind of the fundamental thing, whatever, stuff. These are all kind of the same as substance, so it's hard to define substance without another word for substance, but like the fundamental stuff of reality, or some people say the furniture, is it a part of the fundamental furniture of the universe? While the attributes are what actually and distinctively appear to us in space and time, the things that distinguish one manifestation of a substance from another, something like that. So in terms of behaviorally, substance, so Mead's argument is that substance is equivalent to all those things we commonly do with an object. So it's not really a kind of material, and Mead is presupposing a basically physical universe with nothing super mysterious. going on. And yeah, that's a whole other. He wrote a fair amount about physics, but I'm not going to go into that. Try to go into that right here. But behaviorally, anyway, substance is what we commonly do with an object. So the substance of a house, this is one of his examples, is the house, a house, take a house. The substance of a house is all those things we do with a house, all those behaviors which are common among houses. When you're building a new house, whatever the particular details of it, the attributes or qualities of it, it needs to allow for certain kinds of behaviors. The ultimate substance of house is not to be found by objectively studying a house, like the actual physical house or all houses. All right, there's no physical substance in common between all houses that you might come across. It's to be found by studying what is commonly done in or with or by means of houses. It's to be found by studying what is commonly so what is commonly done in or with houses or by means of houses. And likewise, there are certain things that cannot be done in a house, or it ceases to be a house. It ceases to have the substance of a house. And this is recognized in our laws when we make certain activities illegal in a house, right? There's all these zoning laws and building codes and stuff, which recognize this fact that a house and tries to enforce this fact that a house is a certain kind of place where certain things go on and not certain other things. So running certain kinds of businesses in your house impinges on the houseness of your house and might impinge on the houseness of your neighbor's houses. There's a convention, of course. It's not some kind of I don't know, ultimate thing outside the realm of life. Maybe it's just living creatures that we can say have houses or shelters. And certainly humans, there's a particular kind of housing that they have. And so this is a kind of conventional thing. But it's also, it's a fairly strong convention. A fairly strong convention, but it might be different in different cultures and so on. That's what I mean by that it's a convention. And certainly the laws will be different in different places, which is conventional. So anyways, the substance is about behavioral, maybe behavioral regularity, behavioral functional identity, things like that. But houses, of course, are all a little bit different from each other, and these differences proceed from and lead to different behaviors. Houses may be made from different materials, they may have different colors, different layouts, etc. According to choice, according to human choice, which is itself a kind of behavior. And of course, the people who live in different houses treat their houses differently, right? People have different styles of living. And the interactions of all these differences are the attributes of the substance house. We have a substance house, and then there's these different attributes having to do with the different choices people make and different styles of life and so on. So we can say objects are the same or of the same substance to the extent that they afford common behaviors. They're different or have different attributes or properties to the extent that they afford variable behaviors. So we have invariant is the substance. What is invariant among all behaviors having to do with houses, and what is variable? Okay, and then we'll mention universality versus particularity, another traditional philosophical topic. We also find in Mead's discussion of the meaning of objects, the meaning of universal in particular. Another, so it's kind of related to the substance attributes problem. So what makes objects similar or to or different from each other? So Mead writes that the response is universal and the stimulus is particular. So again, talking about behavior. So it's not something that's actually found in the object per se, but it's something about the relation of the organism to the object. Right? So response is universal, stimulus is particular. So on close investigation, objects are always distinct in some way. So two houses made from the same blueprint, or there's going to be inevitably some small differences, even though they might not be immediately clear, obvious to the naked eye. Their similarity is only in relation to the organism. The example Mead gives is about a hammer. If I need to hit a nail, I'll reach for a hammer. If I don't have a hammer, I might reach for a rock or a brick, something that can serve that function. The commonality of the objects is their special usefulness to me. So the universality of the object is it's useful to me, my response to it. So it's in relation to the organism's behavior that universality or commonality is to be found among objects. I'll also have more to say about this later on a little bit when we talk about language. Okay, so I want to get into gestures. I should try to wrap this up. I don't like to take more than an hour. Okay, but the other sections are shorter. Yeah, I found Mead's writings about objects to be particularly interesting and not a bit different, more extensive than you find in other pragmatists. So I wanted to spend a fair amount of time on that. But let's look at gestures. So Mead's discussion of gestures is inspired, I mentioned earlier, by Wilhelm Wundt's in general, and his works like Principles of Physiological Psychology and Cultural Psychology. These were, well, the first one, Principles of Physiological Psychology, was first published in 1874. Cultural Psychology was published around 1900, so we're in that time period. Wundt had tried to derive language from gestures. Both were seen as expressions of mind. Mead basically agrees that language comes out of gesture as a matter of evolution, as a historical matter, but he refines or alters some parts of Wundt's analysis, or even reverses it, because he's not going to argue that these things come out of mind which exists before them. He's going to argue that mind comes after, although I'm not going to deal with that really here. That's something I'd prefer to do in another topic. So I started by discussing the meaning of objects, but for social creatures like humans, we're very social. Objects are meaningful. Objects as meaningful are largely outcomes of social processes made possible by gestures. All right, so here's another longish quote from Mead. What is the basic mechanism whereby the social process goes on? It is the mechanism of gesture, which makes possible the appropriate responses to one another's behavior of the different individual organisms involved in the social process. Within any given social act, an adjustment is effected by means of gestures of the actions of one organism involved to the actions of another. The gestures are movements of the first organism which act as specific stimuli, calling forth the socially appropriate responses of the second organism. So I mentioned earlier about how objects for humans are created through a social process, at least a lot of the time. So this gets at that. And as gestures being a stimulus in calling out responses of our fellow creatures. Let me give another shorter quote about gestures. There's some other definitions, ways he talks about gestures. So a gesture in the first one at the top there, a gesture is that part of the social act which serves as a stimulus to other forms involved in the same social act. When he says forms, he is usually meaning organisms or life forms. That part of the social act which serves as a stimulus to other organisms involved in the same social act. The second one, gestures are those phases of the act, the social act, which bring about the adjustment of the response of the other form, the other organism. So a gesture has a response, which is an adjustment to it. And then the last one there, the gesture is that phase of the individual act to which adjustment takes place on the part of other organisms in the social process of behavior. So again, adjustment is an important idea here and a very Darwinian kind of idea. So I mentioned this phrase before, but Mead talks about the conversation of gestures. A social act is a conversation of gestures. Mead uses the example of a dog fight, which I actually have kind of a picture of, a GIF of, just for fun, I guess. So one dog shows it is ready to attack, which causes a response or a change in behavior and adjustment in the other dog, which in turn causes a new response on the part of the first dog, and so on. So for the duration of the social act, there's a constant adjustment of each dog to the other. There's a constant transformation of the behavior of one organism in response to the other. With this conversation of gestures, which you can kind of see here. I always think that that black dog looks like a little bear, which can't be right, but I don't know. Just found this online, but it looks like it's fighting a baby bear or something. Yeah, so Mead often gives this kind of example of a dog fight, or in humans, he'll talk about sports like fencing or boxing, which are kind of similar. But they can also have, of course, he recognizes and talks about how boxing and fencing and these human activities can have a deliberative component where you're not just kind of unconsciously or instinctively responding, but there is also that aspect to them where you're instinctively responding to what the other person does, and yeah, and then they instinctively respond to you, especially probably like a street fight and things like that, where people are, it's not something you are, yeah, where it's more spontaneous. Of course, sports, there's a lot of planning and training that goes into it, and it becomes much more deliberate. So the conversation of gestures relies, of course, on what we talked about earlier, on the development of contact and distance perception, which allows us to perceive other organisms as objects. So there's, right, the manipulatory area you see, but you also, gestures are often seen at a distance, but we relate to them as kind of physical things. Yeah, respond to them as potentially impacting us physically. Let's see. Oh, so I've mentioned the kind of going with this. So we talked a lot about how gestures are something that's responded to. They're the stimulus to a response. And this is an important part of the behavioral theory of meaning, is that meaning basically is a response. And Mead makes this pretty clear in a few places. Just wanted to read some of the quotes about that. In the very beginning, he says, first quote, in the very beginning, the other person's gesture means what you are going to do about it. So the meaning of the gesture is what you're going to do about it. Second quote there, the act or adjustive response of the second organism gives to the gesture of the first organism the meaning which it has. Right? So the response to the gesture gives the gesture the meaning that it has. And then last one there, the response of one organism to the gesture of another in any given social act is the meaning of that gesture. So again, very similar. The response to the gesture is the meaning of the gesture. Mention one other thing here that's a little important for understanding Mead. He sometimes writes about a triple or threefold relationship in which meaning exists. This sounds a little bit Peircean. I'm not sure. Well, you can think about how it relates to Charles Peirce. He often had these threefold things, threefold divisions of different things. So this is Mead's anyway. There is an act on the part of one organism, a response on the part of another, and the resulting social act, of which the first gesture is an early phase. So you have the first act, the response, and then these all are part of a broader social act and create part of that social act. So to go back to our dog example, a dog sees another dog it doesn't like and growls at it. The second dog growls back, which in effect is an interpretation of the first growl. It shows the second dog's, you would say, instinctive rather than maybe deliberative interpretation of it. So there's the growl, there's a response, kind of an instinctive response, which is the second dog's interpretation of the growl, that it's a kind of threat. All this adds up to a certain social act that's been initiated. Perhaps a struggle for dominance or for territory, or whatever it is that dogs fight about. So they're involved in some kind of social act, depending on the context, which is the kind of the third aspect of meaning. Okay, so let's go on to significant symbols, the meaning of significant gestures or symbols. This is maybe what Mead is most famous for. I'm not sure. He's famous for a few things to the extent that he's famous. There's a sociological, I can't say today, sociological theory of symbolic interactionism, which is based partly on the work of Mead, probably the earliest work that it is based on is the work of Mead. Maybe it comes out of the work of Mead in a lot of ways, and other people in that Chicago school. And we get here into language at least a bit. I think his theory is more general, more broad, but language is a part of that. So language for Mead is built on gesture, but the vocal gesture is especially important. Why is the vocal gesture so important? Well, this is because we hear our own vocal gesture in almost the same way that another organism hears it. Or to put it the other way around, we hear our own vocal gesture in almost the same way that we hear others' vocal gestures. So we don't see other kinds of gestures in the same way because of perspective and stuff. Mead thinks that because a vocal gesture is objective in this way, so we hear it in the same way. It's an object for us in the same way. I hear my voice at the same time that you hear my voice, and basically in the same way. So Mead thinks that because of this, whichever of us makes the vocal gesture, it's kind of the same thing. You tend to respond to your own speech in the same way that another person might. I think that when you speak, you tend to have the response, the same response that another person would. So the vocal gesture has the same meaning for you that it does for me. This is a theory that I have a little trouble with, but I'll go through it. I'm going to go through it, but what he says about it, because it's interesting. I'm not sure exactly what I think about it. I always have a little trouble making sense of this or finding it useful, but see what you think. So the significant gesture, what he calls the significant gesture, as opposed to just the plain old regular gesture, provides greater control over social action. That's why it got developed, at least in humans. It allows us to know what each other knows, and to know that we know what each other knows. Something like that. So he says, to quote, this is kind of a long quote, but it's worth looking at. The vocal gesture becomes a significant symbol, unimportant as such on the merely affective side of experience, but it becomes a significant symbol when it has the same effect on the individual making it that it has on the individual to whom it is addressed, or who explicitly responds to it, and thus involves a reference to the self of the individual making it. So it has kind of the self and other aspect to it. Right, so I don't think he says in this quote, but in other places he compares like the dog barking doesn't frighten the dog or threaten the dog who barks. The lion roaring doesn't necessarily scare the lion, though there might be some bit of that response there. I don't know. He discusses that. So continuing, the gesture in general and the vocal gesture in particular indicates some object or other within the field of social behavior, an object of common interest to all the individuals involved in the given social act, thus directed toward or upon that object. The function of the gesture is to make adjustment possible among the individuals implicated in any given social act with reference to the object or objects with which that act is concerned. Yeah, so the function of the gesture is to get us all coordinated in terms of some particular object, and the significant gesture or significant symbol affords far greater facilities for such adjustment and readjustment than does the non-significant gesture, because it calls out in the individual making it the same attitude toward it or toward its meaning that it calls out in the other individuals participating with him in the given social act, and thus makes him conscious of their attitude toward it as a component of his behavior, and enables him to adjust his subsequent behavior to theirs in the light of that attitude. So again, we know what each other knows through using significant symbols. That's the basic difference. We're able to know what each other knows because we respond in the same way that, or we have a tendency to respond, an incipient response that's the same as how you would respond. In short, to finish up here, in short, the conscious or significant conversation of gestures is a much more adequate and effective mechanism of mutual adjustment within the social act, involving, as it does, the taking by each of the individuals carrying it on of the attitudes of the others towards himself, than is the unconscious or non-significant conversation of gestures. Right, so it's more, we might say it's more adaptive in the Darwinian sense. So there's an adaptive aspect to developing significant gestures or language, to put it in regular terms. Mead gives a few examples of this, which are interesting. I have some problems with them, but Mead gives a few examples. In giving directions, we give the direction to ourselves, like if we're giving directions how to get somewhere, or even like how to make something. In giving directions, we give the direction to ourselves at the same time that we give it to another. We assume also his attitude of response to our requests, as an individual to whom the direction has the same signification in his conduct that it has to ourselves. So you give directions to someone, you're also hearing those directions, responding to them, but not in the same way, right? But you have some kind of more minimal response, more incipient response, probably, to the directions. Another thing, so asking someone to do something and then doing it yourself, it's like making a request or something, or an order even. So you ask someone to get a chair for a guest, but they are too slow or don't know where to go or whatever, so you end up doing it yourself. This is another of Mead's examples. I find it not so clear-cut in my opinion. So you're already aware that the guest needed the chair, and I'm not sure if the vocal gesture adds much to your own actions. Right? Do you get the chair because you Sid, please go get a chair for the guest, or do you recognize that the guest needs a chair, and then that's the cause of both of those things. So anyways, that example is kind of weird, I think. He also gives the example of the teaching situation. So you try to teach someone something verbally, but you find yourself wanting to do it, especially if the other person is slow or unskilled. I often have this experience trying to explain something to my son, like how to do something, and then I find myself kind of doing it. And it's hard to restrain yourself from doing that, right? It's hard to teach, for example, a child a math problem because you keep wanting to give the answer before they have a chance to, and that's, I guess, why it's good to have training as a teacher. You need to learn to be patient, to wait for the student to answer on their own, to work through it on their own before jumping in with the answer, right? Because when you ask a question, at least if you know the answer, you tend to want to answer it. So those are a few examples he gives. Also, I do have a slide for that. I also mentioned universality before when talking about objects and responding to objects, stimulus and response. So the universality of an object is found in how one responds to it. Objects that have functional similarity in some aspect share a universal feature. So a hammer and a rock might share the universal feature of being able to hit a nail. Significant symbols are also universals for Mead. This is because, as we've seen, it indicates the same thing to you that it does to others. The meaning of the significant symbol is socially shared, so he sees it as universal. We have the same response to it, or if we have the same response to something, to a significant symbol, that the person who makes the symbol, have the same response or the same tendency to respond that you have, you can say it's universal. Yeah, I have some problems with Mead's theory of language. Or at least there's some things that are not quite clear to me yet. I mean, I know Mead's work fairly well, but I haven't read every single thing thoroughly, so maybe if I did so, I would be more confident about his theory of significant gestures. But anyway, that's as far as I'm going to go on that topic today. But it's something to think about if you find it useful or not. There's other writings on language I find more useful, like Dewey I find to be really useful for thinking about language. Peckham, who we'll talk about later on. And yeah, so it's a kind of well-known part of Mead's theory, but yeah, I'm not sure yet exactly what I think about it. So to conclude, I do find Mead's theory of how objects become distinct and meaningful to us to be a really important contribution to a behavioral theory of meaning. And there's something similar to be found in Dewey's work, but I think Mead is actually more thorough on this topic. Mead's theory of gestures is important as well. And it gets more important when we start talking about mind and consciousness and the self and stuff like that, which I do want to add a video to my series on behaviorism and mind about Mead and also about Dewey and some other people, but haven't gotten to it yet. Yeah, so for Mead, mind emerges out of the conversation of gestures, and in humans out of significant gestures rather than the other way around, which is a more traditional view that you have mind and then we create gestures to express our mind and so on. Mead sees it as working the other way around. Yeah, again, I don't find his theory of significant gestures completely satisfactory, but I haven't quite articulated why. Yeah, I think part of it, I wrote down in my notes, I think part of it is that Mead doesn't have a lot to say about misunderstandings, right? He has a lot to say about shared meaning, but not a lot about what happens, why does communication break down? And it does seem to break down fairly regularly. I have communication problems every day. So communication works a lot of the time, and also a lot of the time it doesn't work. I don't know what the percentage breakdown of that is, but Mead doesn't have a lot to say about, at least so far from what I've read of his works, he doesn't have a lot to say about why we have so many communication problems. And this seems to be a big part of significant symbols, right? We often intend one thing, but people hear another thing. So yeah, that's all I have to say about Mead for today. I think really important guy. And actually next I'm going to talk about Charles W. Morris, who was influenced quite a lot by Mead. Like I said, I think he was Mead's student. I'll have to look that up to be sure. But he put together a lot of Mead's posthumous writings, and his own theories are heavily influenced by Mead, somewhat by Peirce also, and so I think it will be interesting, an interesting way to follow up on some of these ideas, to see what he says about that. And yeah, so I've got a few more of these to do after Morris. I want to talk about Skinner, B.F. Skinner, Morse Peckham, and Jordan Peterson. I think those are the main ones I want to get to after this. So coming towards on the home stretch for these. Yeah. And I may add other ones in the future, but yeah. So next, Charles W. Morris. Thanks for watching and be well. See you next time. Bye.